Today, Harry will talk to you about his book. And the thing that's interesting about this book is it's about a soldier from what was at one time the Soviet Union and the trials and tribulations of this young man. And as usual in Russia, everything is horrible and everybody suffers and nothing's easy. And this young man went through all kinds of trials and tribulations. And Harry will tell you how he got onto this person and how he got involved in writing the book. So the lecture will really consist of two parts. One will be the history and the book itself, but also to give you sort of an insight of some of the problems that you run into when you're writing a book, in that this person was from a different culture, different country. He spoke several languages. One of them was not English, but he does speak English, but there was a problem of communicating with the person, and he'll tell you about writing the book. And he has a tape here of part of the interview. So we'll let Harry get started on it. Oh, incidentally, for those of you who are interested, if you want to, he brought a few books with him, and he can sell them to you if you're interested. But he'll now start talking about the book.
Better hold on to this. All right, thank you very much, Al. It's always a pleasure to come out here and to give a talk at the Naturals. This is, I think, my 4th year out here, and I haven't repeated myself yet, although if I come back next year, I think I may start over around 0, because it was a good lecture, the one I gave. All right, I'm here to talk about a book that I wrote. It's called I Survived. My name is Yitzkhak, and you see it up there behind me. You can buy it from Amazon for $18. Although if you want to buy a copy, buy it from me. I'll sell it to you for $15. Amazon is not very kind to authors. They charge $18. Do you know how much the author gets? 50 cents. You pick it right. You do all the work, and Jeff Bezos makes all the money. But what are you going to do there? There are no bookstores around. Although I have been able to get my book into the Holocaust Museum. It's been sold at the Holocaust Museum. But actually my best outlet is the Route 29 Diner in Arlington. How many people have been there? Oh, it's a great place. A great place. Peter Boda is the manager. And I've been selling my book down there, and I've sold probably about 100 or 150 copies down there. So I got to find another diner to go to work with. But there are no bookstores. And this is one of the problems in writing a book, having to publish by an independent publisher. Now, if I may brag, and I'm very modest, I don't like to brag, but last week my book was named the best book of the year in biography by the Independent Publishers Association in North America. So I was really pleased about that, and I put up a notice on Amazon, and I want to send out a notice to a lot of other people. And very soon, probably sometime next week, they're going to send me an envelope with a number of gold stars I can put on the book. I was hoping I would get something like an Oscar. A little more substantial. Maybe I could play, make some money back, but no, I'm just getting some gold stars. But I was very pleased. It's the first time my publisher ever had a book that was awarded top prize in the field. And what can I say? It's a great honor. All right, let me tell you something about this book, how I came to write it, something about Isidore Neiman. This book was over 40 years in the process of writing, not all the time. I started it in 1974. 1974, I was living in Long Branch, New Jersey. I was teaching at Monmouth College. I just finished up my 3rd year of a 3-year contract at Monmouth College. And my wife and I had a baby boy. His name was Eddie. He was born at the Monmouth Medical Center. And at that time, the secretary for the history department, a very nice woman by the name of Peggy, knew another young couple that just had a baby at the Monmouth Medical Center. And that baby's name was Elon. And she thought maybe we would like to get together with Elon and his parents. And I said, sure, why not? I mean, you know, we were new parents. We didn't know anybody, and we didn't know anything about raising a baby. But we did get together, and they were lovely people. And I also met Ann Levy, who was the baby's mother, and her mother and father. That was Mr. and Mrs. Isidore Naiman. Mrs. Naiman was from Russia, and you know, typical Russian grandmother. I mean, she was a great cook, a little bossy, but you know, someone who really took charge of the baby, took charge of the household. So we would go over there in the summer of '74 and talk to them, and you know, my wife and would talk about Eddie and Elon's with Elon's mother, and you know, I just sort of sat around and hung around on the sideline. And then I noticed Mr. Neiman, who would come in, and I mean, he was very pleasant. He'd smile and say hello, but he never talked. He never took part in the conversations. So I gradually worked my way over, and I started talking to him. And I learned that, you know, I knew both he and his wife were from Europe. They were from Russia. And I began asking him about the war, and he began telling me that he was in the Russian army and the Polish army during the war. And he was from a little village by the name of Truchevici. Wow, that sparked my interest. So it took a while to get him to talk. He wasn't very vocal. He had never related his stories of the war years. His wife wasn't interested. He met his wife after the war, and his daughter wasn't interested. And I don't think he ever told anyone about his experiences during the war. But gradually I began to get him to talk. And I said, would you mind if I come over and tape you? We'll type it up and see what we can do. And he agreed. So over the course of the next 2 years, from 1974 to 76, I would visit about once every 2 weeks. We would sit down and go through different elements of his life. Now, I always called him Mr. Neiman. He was born in 1912. He was 62 or 64 at the time. I was 30. Now, at the time I was 30, I thought 62 was as old as Methuselah. I've now changed my opinion. But in any case, I would sit down and talk to him and listen to him. And it was quite challenging because Mr. Neiman's would go from English to Polish to Russian to Ukrainian to Yiddish and to German. Sometimes all in the same sentence. And I mean, it just flowed naturally. A lot of times there was something he wanted to say, but he really couldn't say it in English. So he would try all these other languages. And then after we go through 5 different languages, he would say, you understand? You understand? And then we go back again. If it was in German or Yiddish, I could probably figure it out. But, you know, Polish and Ukrainian and the other miscellaneous languages he spoke were not very intelligible to me. I brought a tape here, and I'm going to let you listen to him describe an episode in his life, and you'll get an idea for the sound and cadence of his speech. The book itself, the language, replicates what he told me. I did very light editing on the book. I didn't really add anything. I added some explanatory material in the beginning and the end of the book, but basically the book is his story as he told it to me. And it reads very well. This is a man who is relating something that was very personal and something he was very proud of, and a period of life that was very difficult for him, how he survived the war. So I'll play that tape. I'll play that tape for you. Now, I talked to Mr. Neiman for about 2 years. And in 1976, excuse me, if this is my wife, I better take it. No, it's Lexington, Kentucky. Some insurance company has to talk to me about lowering my health insurance rates. And these people are real pests. They don't give up. So I'm going to have to call up and tell them where to go. In any case, where was I? I worked with him for about 2 years. And then I typed up the manuscript. Here's the manuscript right here. Now, I made a mistake. I should have given to him every chapter. as I finish each chapter and go through each chapter. I didn't do that. I typed up the entire manuscript, and it's about 13 or 14 chapters. And another mistake I made was that I only started interviewing his wife toward the end, when he met his wife in Russia and they got married. I've got 2 or 3 good chapters there about their life in Russia and how they got out of Russia. And that is a harrowing story. So I typed it up, and then I gave it to him, and I went over to see him. And his wife was not very pleased with me. I think she was a little jealous that I had spent all my time talking to him and taking down his story, and I didn't take down her story. So, I said thank you very much, and I left. And one thing after another happened. Basically, we moved from Long Branch to East Windsor, New Jersey. I got a job in Philadelphia. And eventually I got a job in Washington, and I came to Washington. And I worked for the Park Service of Washington for the next 35, 36 years. And I lost contact with Mr. Neiman. And it would always bother me. I would see this manuscript on my bookshelf from time to time, and I kept thinking, you ought to finish this, you ought to do something about this. I would take it into my World War II class and read portions of it to my students in the World War II class, and they always liked it. But I thought, well, I don't know, maybe this isn't publishable, so I really didn't do anything. Well, I was spurred into action last year. Last year was medically very challenging for me. In addition to my double knee revision surgery, which I wouldn't recommend on my worst enemy, I was diagnosed with cancer, prostate cancer. Well, prostate cancer is all right, but when I received that diagnosis of prostate cancer, all of a sudden I began to think, maybe I don't have a lot of time to put this off. So I got to work on it, and luckily my daughter found the tapes. I wasn't sure where the tapes were. I had them buried in a closet. So I pulled them out of the closet. Now the problem is they're those old 8x5, 8 and small cassette tapes. And I didn't have a cassette recorder, but go on to Amazon and you can buy a cassette recorder. So I bought a cassette recorder and I began listening to the tapes. And then I realized that I really had managed to capture this man's story. And what I had was pretty accurate. There were a few places that I needed to fill in, needed to correct, but it was actually quite accurate. So I started to work on it. I found a publisher, Word Association Press. I sent him the manuscript, the publisher, they scanned it, and then I began to do revisions, and I began to think about maps, and I began to think about photographs. One regret I have is that I have photographs of Mr. Neiman's wife, his daughter, and his son. I never took a photograph of Mr. Neiman. And so I remember what he looked like, but I don't have a photograph. And I can't take a photograph now. I checked him out on Google, and he died in 2003. So he received the draft manuscript, and I know he was very pleased. And I'm sorry that I waited so long that I could not give him the finished final product here, because I know he would be pleased. He would be pleased with that. So in any case, let me go over here and pull down some maps. Mr. Neiman was born in Russia in 1912, before the First World War. He was born in a small town called Butowsky, and his family was from another small town called Czechowice. Now, unless you're Polish, try to figure out how to spell Czechowice. Hold on, let me... Okay, Mr. Neiman was born in Russia, right about this area. This is not too far from Brest-Litovsk. This is before the First World War. I would say I was relating this story to my World War II class last year and bemoaning the fact that I couldn't spell Czechowice. And one young lady sitting in the front row pulled out her cell phone and within 30 seconds found Czechowice on her cell phone along with the map. So after that I became very impressed with the power of Google, in the power of cell phones. Okay, so that's where he was born. This is Poland that came into existence after the end of the war. Chechevichi is in this area. He's only about 20 miles from Belarus, from White Russia. Now, the people who lived here were incorporated into the Polish state, but essentially they were Russians. And Mr. Neiman spoke Russian, and he spoke Polish. This area was heavily fought over during the First World War and would be more heavily impacted during the Second World War. This is the area of the Jewish Pale. There were about 300 families in Mr. Neiman's village, Chechevichi, which was called Big Chechevichi because there's a small Chechevichi. And about 5 or 6 of those families were Jewish. They didn't farm. His father was sort of a blacksmith, handyman. Another family ran a local store that supplied goods that farmers could not produce themselves. But this is the area of the Jewish Pale. All right, here you see the same map, and it has the linguistic divisions. The pink areas are Polish. This area is Belarusian, which is essentially a dialogue of Russian. This area is Ukrainian. Mr. Neiman could handle every language. He would just go from one language to the next language, which always amazed me. Okay, this is another map showing the boundary. It's only about 20 miles from the border. Okay. So he's from a village called Chechevichi. This is a photograph taken of church in Chechevichi today. It's still rather a modest community. Hasn't changed very much, although there are currently no Jews living in Chechevichi anymore. Well, somewhere here I have a photograph of a typical house in Chechevichi. I'll find it eventually. All right. So this is the story, and what I'm going to do, if I can get back and not fall down and break my neck, is I'm going to start to read you from the book. Why don't you put on the light, Al? All right, so the title is I Survived. My name is Yitzkhak, and I have a train on the cover because during the war, that's how he survived. He took the train. He traveled all over Russia. He went from Belarus all the way back to Moscow, past Moscow, down to Tashkent, and all the way through the interior of Russia. His main aim during this period of time was not to be in the front lines. A soldier in the front ranks of the Russian army had an average lifespan of 2 to 3 weeks. So he wanted to survive, so he made sure he was in logistics and support. And the fact that he was a butcher helped a lot. And a lot of the work he did was in logistics and support. All right. Let me get to the opening chapter here. This is how the book begins. My name is Isidore Neiman. In Jewish, my name is Yitzkhak. I was born in 1912 in Russia during the time of the Tsars in my mother's village of Butowsky, which was 19 miles distant from my village of Chechevichi. My mother and father were cousins. Many Jews married their distant relations. We never traveled very far from the village, and it was difficult to meet someone who was not a friend or a distant relative. It was also dangerous to travel too far from home. Many people would rob and kill Jews if they had a chance to do so. It was much safer to stay home, where you knew your neighbors and you trusted them. I was born in my maternal grandfather's house in Butowsky. My grandfather was a blacksmith. He was a very handy man and could make almost anything with his hands. Every village needed a blacksmith who knew how to fix things. We made everything by hand because there were no factories. My grandfather could build a whole wagon from just lumber and metal scraps that he had in his shop. He could make horseshoes and horse nails by hand. Every horse needed 24 nails and 4 horseshoes, so there was always plenty of work for my grandfather. I learned how to be a blacksmith from him and my father. It was a good way to make a living. I was the oldest of 4 children. I had 2 brothers and 1 sister. One brother was in the Russian army and disappeared. This was very common during the war. If you were in the army and you were killed, they wouldn't notify the family. Sometimes they wouldn't even bury you. They would just leave you where they fell. So one brother disappeared. Another brother who was in the army with Mr. Neiman survived the war, and he went to live in Israel after the war. So most of the people in my village where I grew up were white Russians. They were all farmers, and the farmers always needed a blacksmith to work for them. So we would get together to encourage one to settle on their village. They gave my grandfather a house to live in with a large garden. And essentially that's how they lived. There were very few Jews in the village. In my village in Chechevichi, we had only 20 Jewish families, 350 Russian families. The Jews were not farmers. During the time of the Tsars, they were not allowed to own any land. And after the First World War, they could legally own land, but the farmers would never sell them land. The farmers only wanted to buy land. Then he talks about other relatives. He had an uncle who was a businessman in the village. He had cousins, and he talks about his family. Okay. He, growing up, he helps his father in the shop, and he learns to become a blacksmith. His grandfather died sometime around 1920, so his grandmother came to live with us. And she would help my mother around the house. My mother would get up at 5 in the morning and make a fire. We had no coal. We had to make fire out of wood, which we took from the forest. The wood was not free. We had to pay a fee for it. We had to pay a rich Polish nobleman who lived in Paris and who owned the forest. We cut the wood in the forest during the winter. It was hard work, but it had to be done. We had little furniture in our house. It was just a plain house. We only had a few tables, a bed, and some chairs. My father would get up after my mother and give hay to the cows and take care of the other animals. My mother would then begin to cook potatoes for breakfast. Sometimes she would make bread and give us milk for breakfast. For lunch we had more potatoes, usually in a soup with a piece of cabbage. We ate a lot of potatoes because they were cheap, and they were very good, and I could eat potatoes all day. I could even eat them all day, even now. We never became tired of them. After breakfast, my mother would milk the cow and put the milk in large pots that were used for milk. If the milk was very rich, she would make sour cream, which would be 2 or 3 fingers deep. And then if it was, and then sometimes just 2 fingers deep. She also made butter from the milk. We children always liked the milk best when it came right from the cow. It was warm and delicious. We had 4 cows at home. We had enough milk. Mr. Neiman loved potatoes. He would eat potatoes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And one of his jobs as a young boy was to take the horse out into the forest and let the horse graze on the fresh grass in the forest during the spring and summer. And he loved doing that because he would take the horse out, and while the horse was grazing, Mr. Neiman would build a fire with his brothers, and they would bake potatoes. And they were out there in the fresh air all day. We children had to go to school every morning. The way there was no school organized by the Russian government. The way they had school was that the Jewish families in these local communities, such as Lunitz and Chechevichi, would get together, and they would all hire a teacher, a school teacher, who would come to the village, and the school teacher would actually live with each family for a week. And you had the teacher one week, and someone else had the teacher the next week. And they would feed the teacher, and if they had some money, they would pay him a little money. But education was very important to them. They studied the Bible, they studied Talmud, they also studied Russian, they studied Polish. So they were fairly well educated. Both boys and girls went to school, although it was more important to send a boy to school. Now, if you were really good, if you're a really good scholar and they identified you, they would send you to Lunes, and you could study to become a rabbi, or you would study, at a higher level. That was considered to be a great honor. Mr. Naaman was a good student, but he never was identified to go on and to become a rabbi. Now, during the First World War, all the Jews in this area were evacuated by the Russian government. They had to leave, and they were sent about 200 kilometers deeper into Russia. Now, one thing I learned about Mr. Naaman was that anything more than 10 miles from where he lived was deep Russia. So people were always being sent into deep Russia. But deep Russia could have been 50 miles away, it could have been 1,500 miles away, I don't know. But that's how we referred to to Russia, and people being sent into Russia. Now it's interesting. He really loved that life, and he told me. He said, "We had a good life in the village. We were poor. We had no money. We were poor in material wealth, but rich with other goods. It was a happy life, and I still miss it." He still misses it. Now, 1919, the family returns to Chechevichi. His father and grandfather come home first. Their houses have been occupied by Polish farmers, but the village tells the Polish farmers they have to move. And so the father and the grandfather get their houses back because they were blacksmiths. They needed to be blacksmiths. So the fathers came back and they fixed up the house, and then they brought Mr. Naaman and his brother, and two brothers and a sister back, and with his mother, they brought her back. Now, when they got back to town, there was a story going around town. There had been a great incident in the town, something that the villagers couldn't stop talking about, and something that they never forgot. What happened was that this area became part of Poland after the war. So the Polish government began to survey the land to determine where the boundary was between Poland and Russia. Soldiers were constantly going back and forth. So one day a Polish colonel shows up with two enlisted men, and he's going through the forest, and they're making maps. And they stopped at the house of a man who lived outside of town, and they asked if they could stay the night there. And he looked at them and he saw that this was an officer, a man of considerable importance and wealth. He had a nice ring on, he had nice clothes, he had nice boots on. So he said, yes, you can stay here. And he let them sleep in the barn. He gave them fresh straw to use in the barn. And when they got up in the morning, he made them breakfast, and he wanted to know how to get on to the next town. So he said, you go down this road, 5 kilometers, and then you take a right at the fork of the road. Well, what he didn't know was the man who had contacted his friends from Chechevichi. And he said, look, we got these 3 rich guys here, and they're going to be riding down this road at 7, 8 a.m. in the morning by themselves. Okay, so they arranged to ambush the 3. And the 3 came down the road about 8 o'clock in the morning, and they were jumped by these villagers. There were about 5 of them there. They killed the colonel, and they captured the 2 enlisted men. Why did they do it? They did it because the colonel had a nice ring. The colonel had a bracelet. He had good boots. He had a good coat on. They did it just to steal from him. I mean, life meant nothing for these people. Life was very cheap. They had just been through the First World War. Life was very cheap. So they killed the colonel. And then they buried the colonel in a shallow grave. And now what do we do with these 2 soldiers? Well, they weren't really, have a problem with the 2 soldiers. They took them into the town. They took them to the city hall. And, what is the equivalent? The mayor comes out, and they have a great debate. And should they kill the soldiers? Should they let the soldiers go? But what essentially they did was they beat the soldiers. The men who had killed the colonel came up and they really beat the soldiers up bad. And then eventually they said, we'll let them go. So they let the soldiers go, and that was it. Soldiers got out of town. They walked back to Lunitz, and then they took a train back to Warsaw. A month goes by. Everybody's forgotten about the incident. I mean, it's forgotten. Nobody pays any attention to it. However, the Polish army did not forget about the incident, because the soldiers go back, and then the Polish army sends 200 men on horseback, lancers, uhlans. They show up one night and they surround the village. And the soldiers take them to the house of, where they had slept that night. And they roust that man out of bed. And they let him know that they're here to exact justice for Colonel McCreskey. His name was McCreskey. So they make him take them to the houses of the other men who were involved. There were 5 men involved, and they managed to capture 4 of them. 1 got away. 1 managed to run away. So they take these men into the village. In the village, they roust the whole village. And they rounded up every man in the village between the ages of 17 and 70. And they had benches set up. They made them bend down over the benches. They beat them with, birch bark sticks. They beat them on the back until their rear ends were bleeding. Then they took their 5 men now, who they had as prisoners. They took bayonets and they cut their eyes out. Then they told the families, we want you to prepare coffins. And everybody's upset now. So the families prepare coffins, they bring the coffins back, and they put the coffins in the back of a wagon, and they put them in the wagon. They then decide they're going to burn the entire village to the ground. Now by this time the townspeople are frantic, and there's a priest with the soldiers. He's a Catholic priest. But they all run up to him and they plead with him that they didn't have anything to do with this. Please spare the village. So the priest argues for them, and the soldiers decide to spare the village. Well, what they did is they took the 4 men that they had to the cemetery. They made their families dig graves, and then they shot each of them in the back of the head, put them in the coffin, and buried them. Then they went to the place where they buried the colonel, and they dug the colonel up, and they went back to Warsaw. Well, this told the people of the village there that they better be on their good behavior and not mess with the Polish army. The Polish army would actually send soldiers to live in the village for the next 10 years. Now, this was a story Mr. Neiman told me. Now, what I'm going to do is to play this tape, and I want you to listen to him as he relates the story. We're not going to listen to the entire story because it'll take too long, but you'll hear the sound of his voice and how he spoke. And it's going to start at the time when the soldiers, when the men come to the village and it's decided to rob them.
All of a sudden comes to his house 3 men dressed, and you see one was a high man. That was a pukovnik, they called him. An officer, big officer. Pukovnik like a major. Maybe he's higher than a major. This pukovnik is the step to for general. How is he like? Colonel. But this is from pukovnik, he goes for general. He's a colonel. So, and 2 soldiers with him. And with maps, papers, all kind of equipment what they need. And they was marking maps. They was important. They needed, that time was not Poland. It was Poland that come, all the kind of parties used to come, all the kind. But Poland was, the whole main place was in Warsaw. The whole population, the whole garnison, they call, the whole staff. Main, how they call it, United States. It was in Russia, in the capital city, the capital city. They kept it because the Tsar wasn't, and all the Polish population is there in Russia. Yeah, Russia could and remember. So, and they got in his house. It was dark, starting dark, and they asked him if they can stay overnight. So they let him in, and they told him who they are, what they do, where they go, everything. They took him in, they let him to sleep, they feed him, they give him food, supper, what he could. They had what to eat because they always had more food than in the village, in the woods, village. So they told him they want to go the rest, how the way goes to Butowsky, the roads, the villages, what kind of villages for, and the roads, how it's go, and everything. And he told them because they live there, they know. And they give him a nice place to sleep. And night, the Kanchar, the same watchman, he got dressed and he ran in the village, Chushevich, and they told the rest of them. So what's going on? 3 men were sleeping in his house, and since one man it looks like a big man, a high officer, and they will go through Lavica, because he showed them the road, how it's go. It's no road in Lavica, but they have to cut a shortcut with the woods through the road. You understand? Yes. So they went there and they sat, and right away they got dressed, all of them, and they came and they blocked the road, the whole place, the Lavica, Woody, showed them the road, Ganchar, same man what they were sleeping in his house. He walked with him close and he showed them this. Why did they, do you know why they did that? That was, nobody knows till now. After, if you say, has to do with politics, there's no interest in politics. Just to kill, let's see. Just to kill, to harm. But because when he was on this place, Lavica, I was there. In 1929, I was there. Yeah.
All right.
Because I'm running there, a big runner.
The stories that I tell in the book would take Mr. Neiman 2 or 3 nights to relate. He went into incredible detail, and he would repeat himself, and then he would go back again and tell the same story again. But I think that gives you an idea as to what it was like listening to Mr. Neiman and having him recall these tales. And again, he spoke English, but it was an English heavily peppered with Russian, Polish, Yiddish, White Russian, and all sorts of phraseology that I didn't know. It was a real challenge. Another challenge in taking this down was that I thought the man was paranoid, because he was convinced, this was 1974, that the Russian KGB was going to get him, because he did a lot of illegal things during the war. If you were going to survive in Russia, you had to do illegal things. You had to lie, cheat, steal. And, the NKVD, the secret police, were always on the lookout for people breaking the rules. And he was convinced that they still had his record. And if he, gave too much information, they would find him, or they would track down people he had interacted with. So one of the rules of the recording was, number one, I couldn't use anybody's full name, especially the last name. So if a man's name was Gansha, I would say G. Or if it was Zelki, I would say Z. That was one rule. The other rule is that as he traveled around Russia after the war began, I couldn't name the city. So if he went to Tashkent, I could only say he went to T. And this caused a problem when I was trying to put the book together, trying to figure out where a lot of these cities were, especially when the names were in Polish and in Russian. He was paranoid, but after a while I realized that the reason he survived was that he was paranoid. You had to be paranoid because they were after you. And you didn't really have to do anything illegal. They would arrest you for no reason at all. And you'd wind up in the gulag or they would shoot you. But he still had that fear of the Russian NKVD. So I had to be careful. Well, this is a story that is one of the more interesting stories. And it gives you an idea of the lawlessness of this area where he grew up and the potential for violence. Once, 2 or 3 years after the war was over, the Polish government restored effective control to the area around Chechevici, and they kept the army there for about 10 years. Now, the White Russians were not that happy with the Polish army, but the Jews were very happy. They felt that the army provided security. One thing about the relationship between the Jewish community and the Russian community was it was generally very good. Mr. Neiman grew up and he knew the people in the village from the time he was very young. But you never knew when they would turn on you. They could turn on you on a dime. Something would happen and they could become very hostile, very violent. And they could become murderous. This is why you stayed close to home. If you traveled too far from home and you're on the road alone, and some White Russians came across you with say you had a wagon and you were collecting wood scraps or metal scraps, and they decided they want your wagon, they would just kill you and leave your body on the road. They wouldn't think anything about it. If you were close to home, you were pretty safe because you knew the people in the area and you were considered one of them. But a lot of Jews just turned up dead if they traveled too far and they went too far from home. So you always had to be careful. Now, let me just show you the Polish army put up a monument to the colonel.
Is this World War I, you said?
This is World War I. Okay. Hold on a moment. Okay. This is a monument to the colonel now in Chechevici. You see there's a cross here. And this is where he was killed. Now the interesting thing is that they actually took his body back to well, they took his body back to Warsaw and they buried him. They buried him in a church in Warsaw. But the interesting thing is, I looked up information on the Colonel Butowsky on the internet, and in the official version, they don't have him being shot and killed by what were essentially lawless bandits being robbed. They had him dying in conflict with the Bolsheviks. The Poles were fighting the Bolsheviks at the time, so I guess they thought it was more honor or greater dignity to be killed in battle with the Bolsheviks. So according to the official Polish records, he was leading his regiment in a charge against the Bolsheviks, and they don't relate the story of how he was actually murdered. All right, that monument as far as Mr. Neiman knew in 1974, was still there. The Poles would never go near it. I mean, the White Russians would never go near it. But people would come out from Warsaw from time to time to visit. So this was a life that Mr. Neiman led. It was a good life. It was a happy life. They had enough food to eat. They got along with their neighbors. It was a very simple life. It was the life in the Jewish Pale. Incidentally, this area where Mr. Neiman lived, this area of Belarus and Poland and Ukraine, is an area that Timothy Snyder wrote about, called Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin. Between 1933 and 1945, 14 million civilians in this area will be murdered either by the Germans or the Russians. So this was a very deadly area to be living in. That's not only the Holocaust, that also includes the famines and the massacres that the Russians carried out by the NKVD. All right, in the 1930s, about 32 or 33, Mr. Neiman is 21 years old, and he gets a note that he's being drafted into the Polish army. As soon as you turn 21, you got to go into the Polish army. The Russians weren't very happy about going into the Polish army, but Mr. Neiman didn't care. He didn't go into the Polish army. So he shows up, and he boards the train for Lunetz, and they ride 2 or 3 days. He goes through Warsaw, which was quite an experience. He had never been to Warsaw. And they wind up at an army camp near the German border. And they put him in a barracks, and for 2 days they leave him alone. Now, Mr. Neiman thinks this is wonderful. They draft you in the army, they give you a cot to sleep in, and you can sleep all day, and they feed you 3 good meals. What could be better? Well, on the 3rd day, he found out what life was like. First of all, they rationed them all out, and they sent them to the supply tent to be outfitted with uniforms. They never measured you. The sergeant just took a look at you and decided what size shirt and pants you wore and what size boots you wore. Now, your boots could be 3 sizes too small or 5 sizes too large. It made no difference. Whatever they gave you, you used. Once they got them outfitted, they began their training. They gave them indoctrination classes in the Polish language. They gave them classes in Polish history. Mr. Neiman was assigned to the cavalry, which he thought was wonderful. He loved horses. They would get up 5 o'clock in the morning. He would have to take care of his horse. He would go to the barn. It was very important. You took care of your horse morning, noon, and night. You had to comb the horse, feed the horse, and groom the horse. After you did that, you had a very quick breakfast, which was coffee and bread, and they would give you bread for the whole day, and you could save the bread for lunch or dinner. Then you would have drill, you would have marching, you would have weapons training, and they would keep you going until 6 or 7 o'clock at night, every day, one right after the other. One interesting feature of this was that they were very concerned about your religion. Now, most of the enlistees were Catholics, so every Sunday they marched them off to church. They would go to church, and if you were Ukrainian and Orthodox, you would go to the Catholic Church. They didn't have Ukrainian Orthodox services. But if you were Jewish, they would march you off to the synagogue on Sunday, whether you wanted to go or not. So they went to the synagogue on Sunday. Mr. Neiman loved the Polish army. He really took to the Polish army, and he was very proud to be a soldier in the Polish army. In fact, I think when I knew him, and until the day he died, he would still consider himself to be a Polish soldier. He loved his horse, he loved his lance, he would ride, he had a good relationship with his officers and his NCOs, and they had a trick that they would play. When new recruits would come in and show up, they would call Mr. Neiman, and then the sergeant would give the new recruits a lecture, saying, we're going to do this, this, and this, and this, and this is what you're going to learn. And I want you to look at this guy here. This guy is the biggest screw-up you ever met. He doesn't know his right foot from his left foot. And he would tell him to get on his horse and do certain drills. And Mr. Neiman would get on his horse and he'd do the drills perfectly. And then the sergeant would say, see, if we can teach this idiot to do the drills, we can teach you to do the drills. He was in the Army for 2 years. During that time, he had only one leave. He came home that summer for 1 week. Now, when he came home, the Army issued you a new uniform. And you got home and you had to register with the local police. They watched you when you came home. Because a lot of times these enlistees would come home and they would get drunk and they'd start fighting and they'd cause problems. And if they did, they were arrested right away and they were sent back. Well, Mr. Neiman couldn't believe it. He shows up in his house, and the house looks small, and the family looks at him, and he's grown, and he's filled out, and he has this beautiful uniform. So he was home for about a week, and then he goes back into the Army, and he serves out his remaining year in the Army. As his year is drawing to a close, he has mixed feelings. He wants to get back home and be with his family, but he likes the Army. He doesn't really have anything back home. I mean, back home he's the son of a blacksmith, and he's sort of a petty trader. But in the Army, he has a horse, he has a lance, he has status, and he has a position in the Army. But 1934, he's out of the Army, and he goes back home, and he goes to work for his father as a blacksmith, and he would travel around the area, and he would, trade with the farmers. He'd buy cows and he'd buy pigs. And this is how he made his living. Now, these people knew nothing about what was happening in the world. They had vague rumors of somebody by the name of Hitler in Germany, and they knew he wasn't good for the Jews, but they didn't know. They would get one newspaper a week. It would come in from Warsaw, and it would come in Polish, and they would go to the center of the town, and someone who could read would read the newspaper and translate it into Russian or translate it into Yiddish. But Hitler's rearming Germany. There are war clouds that are growing, and they simply don't know anything about it. Nothing about it. Now, it's interesting, during this period of time, about 1938, right before the beginning of the Second World War, Mr. Neiman got married, and his wife had 2 young boys. He had twin sons. It was really hard to get that information out of him. I almost missed it. He almost didn't say anything. And again, that was an area he wouldn't talk about. Sometimes I'd talk to him, and there were certain areas that you could probe, and certain things he wouldn't talk about. But I did find out he got married, but he wouldn't tell me anything about it. 1939, he knows that something's happening, that war is coming. Conditions are getting very tense. The war breaks out in September 1939, and Mr. Neiman is expecting to be called up into the Army, but Poland collapses before he's called up. He was lucky, though. He's in the part of Poland that's occupied by the Russians. So by the 3rd week in September, the war is over. The Germans aren't there, the Russians aren't there, and the Polish police run away. The Jews are nervous. This is a time of great danger. About a week after the war is over, 2 Russian soldiers show up, and they're laying telegraph lines. So they go up to the Russian soldiers and they say, what's it like in Russia? How is it? And the soldiers tell them, it's wonderful. It's paradise. Everybody has a job. Everybody has food. You're going to love it. So Mr. Neiman and they all think, wow, this is great. We're going to be living in paradise. Well, a few days later, the Russian army shows up, and paradise turns out not to be paradise. One of the things that the Russians did after they showed up was they went around the village. They figured out who had 2 homes and who had property. If you had 2 homes, you had to give up 1 home. If you had a store, you were ordered to sell off your entire stock. They told everyone in the village to go to the stores and buy up what was in the store. Use your Polish money. Now, the storekeepers didn't want to sell them. They wanted to keep their merchandise, but they had to sell them. And then the Russians would come to individuals in the town. They would say, your tax bill for this year is 5,000 rubles. Well, where am I going to get 5,000 rubles? Well, you can go into the woods and cut so much wood, and that'll take care of your tax bill. But after about 6 months, what they do is they took all the money out of the village. For example, the storekeepers had a lot of Polish money. After they sold off their stock, they couldn't get more stock. Then the Russians announced that the Polish money wasn't good anymore. You know, we're using rubles now. So they went around and they got rid of anybody that had a business had to shut down the business. Mr. Neiman, for example, worked as a butcher. And, you know, the question is, am I an exploiter of the masses? I mean, I work by myself. So he continued working as a butcher, a kosher butcher. And he had a friend who was a communist, who was connected to the Communist Party, who said, look, I'll warn you when you have to stop. Well, you know, life under the Russians was very interesting. Very soon, a lot of refugees began flooding across the border. A lot of Jewish refugees were coming across the border. And they would put them up. Mr. Neiman's father and mother, for example, put up like 3 or 4 young Jewish boys in their house. And they would tell these terrible stories about the Germans, how the Germans were picking up Jews and they were shooting them in the streets. And all the horrible things were happening. Now, they couldn't believe this because they had been exposed to the Germans in the First World War. But why would somebody come in and just want to shoot us? We didn't do anything. Why would they do that? Some of these young boys would become homesick, and they would slip back across the border. Big mistake, because they go back across the border, they were picked up with the Germans, and they were shot, or they wound up in a concentration camp. Interestingly enough, it was the Russians who saved the lives of a lot of these young Jewish boys, because in 1940, fall of 1940, the Russian government put up a notice saying, you know, we've come to an agreement with the Germans, you can go back home. Report to the train station at 9 a.m. and we'll give you a ticket and you can go back home and you don't have to sneak across the border. So everybody goes to the train station, the Russians give them tickets to get on the train, and where do they wind up? In deep Russia. They sent them all to Siberia. Now they saved their lives, because that meant when the Germans invaded, they weren't there. 1941, Mr. Neiman can sense that things are getting very intense. He sees a lot of rail traffic, trains carrying artillery, trains carrying tanks. He sees a lot of troops moving into the area. He doesn't know what's happening, but he knows that whatever's going to happen is not going to be good. But the Russians reassure the villagers that when the Germans come, we're going to break their necks. You don't have to worry. We're going to break their necks. All right. June 1941, June 21st, the Germans invade. Immediately, Russian control of the village dissolves. The villagers are on their good behavior. A lot of them wanted the Germans to come because they hated the Russians. Nobody knows what to do. I would liken it to you're living along the coast and a hurricane is coming, and how do you prepare for the hurricane? What do you do? Well, they all walked around trying to decide what to do. Do you stay? Do you run away? Mr. Neiman, goes to sleep about 3 o'clock in the morning. There's a knock on the door, and he's told by one of his friends he's been drafted into the Russian army. Report at 9 a.m. to the train station. Now, he's got a real problem. He's got a wife and 2 young sons. What does he do? If you're going to run away, you have to be young, and you have to be essentially by yourself. You can't have young children with you. His parents couldn't run away. His parents were in their late 50s. There were a lot of people who couldn't run. Mr. Mr. Neiman's father comes to talk to him about 3 a.m. in the morning, and I think what he told him was that he had to go to the army. Whatever happened, they would manage in Chechevici, but you survive. You do what you need to do to live. This is what's important. So 9 a.m. comes, he goes there, the whole village is there, he gets on the train, and he heads for Lunetz. He will never return to the village. He will never see his mother and father again. He will never see his wife again. He will never see his baby sons again. The Germans will show up in the village 5 days after Mr. Neiman leaves. They rounded up every Jewish male in the village and shot them immediately. Everyone. The women and children, they left alone for a few weeks. Then they rounded them up and they sent them to Lunetz, where they were put in a ghetto. In July, August 1942, they were put on trains and sent to Auschwitz. So, within a year, Mr. Neiman lost his entire family. Now, his brother was also drafted into the army. His brother is going to survive. He has a cousin who was also drafted into the army. His cousin survives. Mr. Neiman gets on this train and they head to Lunetz, and they're traveling into Russia. Everywhere they go, it's chaos. People are running. People don't know what to do. Mr. Neiman looks out of the train and he sees people walking on the roads. He saw his old teacher on the road walking with his 2 young sons. He thinks he saw an ant walking along the road, but he couldn't stop and he couldn't get off. While they're on the train and they're on cattle cars, they come to a bridge, and he looks up and there are German planes overhead. And the Germans are going to bomb the bridge, drop the bridge, and the train goes into the water. Now, Mr. Neiman's car was not one of the cars that went into the water, but this is the first time he's going to see people killed during the war. There's a Russian lieutenant who's in charge of them standing in the front of the train, who falls off the train, and the train runs over him. And Mr. Neiman jumps off the train to see how the Russian lieutenant's doing. He's obviously dead, but his eyes are going back and forth. The Russians just picked up his gun, picked up his papers, and then they left him. And that's what they did. They just left him. They go to a rail junction in town. It's about 3 or 4 days of riding, and everything is messed up. All the trains are clogged. They can't get through this rail junction. While they're sitting there all morning, the German planes come over, and Mr. Neiman is saying, "We've got to get off this train. They're going to bomb us." The Germans come over and they bomb that rail junction, and they kill hundreds of people who are on those trains. Well, Mr. Neiman manages to survive. The Russian NKVD comes back after that attack, and what do? They get the man who's head of the junction, who's in charge of routing the trains, and they accused him of being a German spy, German saboteur, and they shot him. As Mr. Neiman is riding the train, he doesn't know where he's going. He gets off the train for a day or 2 or 3 at a time, and they put him to work, basically loading ammunition on the train. They stop at a Russian fuel dump in the forest, and he's there for a week and told to guard the fuel. While he's guarding the fuel, he can hear Germans in the air. "Kameraden, come here. Kameraden, come here." And he's told that if anyone comes near him, the signal is to knock on the pipes. They don't knock on the pipes, you shoot them. So he's there one night and somebody approaches him. They don't knock on the pipes, so he takes his rifle out and he shoots them. Doesn't hit him, but he shoots him. Well, it was lucky. It turns out it was a Russian officer he was shooting at. So he's put up on trial for dereliction of duty, and he's sentenced to 10 days in jail, which he thought was wonderful. They put him in jail, and he gets to sleep all day, and he gets 3 square meals a day. Well, that lasted 3 days. Then they pardoned him for jail. So for the next 6 months, from June until December 1941, Mr. Neiman is riding the train. And basically, he's falling back further and further into Russia. He's with a group of about 100 men. They're all former Polish soldiers. About 2/3 of them were Jews. One third of them were, white Russians, some Ukrainians. As they're falling back, the white Russians and Ukrainians decided to desert. And they tell the Jews, look, you wait here, and we're going to go over the other side of the road and reconnoiter. And the Jews knew what was happening. They went on the other side of the road and they took off. Well, the Russian lieutenants who were in charge of them, wanted to be in charge of them, because if they lose, Mr. Neiman and his fellows, they're going to have to go in the army. They're going to wind up in the front ranks. So as long as they're with these guys, they're okay. So they fall back and fall back and fall back. By December 1941, he's south of Moscow, at the outskirts of Moscow. This is the Battle of Moscow, and he's working day and night loading ammunition on the trains. Basically now, for this time and for the rest of the war, he's traveling around Russia, he's working in factories, and he was very good with his hands. They put him on a train once, and there's a margarine plant that they disassemble. And they get off the train and he's told to assemble the machinery. He's never seen the machinery before, but he knows machinery, he can figure it out. So he puts it back together again. He can listen to any piece of machinery, and if something is wrong with it, he can take it apart and get the right part and put it back together again. And if they don't have a part, he's a blacksmith. He can make the part. So during this period of time, as he's traveling around, he will sometimes go into work camps. They will assign him to work camps, which he thought was a good deal because he didn't have to ride the rails so much. And how he gets the job is jobs are interesting. For example, in 1942, he was out in some unknown town, and he's waiting for reassignment. He's worried that they're going to put him in the front lines, and he tells the Russian officer, I need a new assignment. I finished my last assignment. The officer says, sit on that bench. So Mr. Neiman sits on the bench for like 4 days, which he thought was good because he could sleep and he could eat. And then after the 4th day, a factory owner shows up and says, I need help. I've got this team of horses. I need to deliver all these goods. And, the one horse is one mean son of a bitch of a horse. And the woman who's in charge of the team can't control them. So Mr. Neiman loves horses, and he raises his hand, and he says, I'll take the job. This is the director, and he's going to be with the director for a year. Best job he ever had. So Mr. Neiman is, working in this factory now, and he's delivering material. And he knew how to take care of horses. He would approach the horse, and the horse would try to kick him or bite him. And every time the horse would do that, Mr. Neiman had a big stick, and he whacked the horse on the head. And after about a week, he's got that horse under really good control. But this was a good job because he could steal from the factory. The factory had sugar, the factory had tea, the factory had rubber boots. And one of the interesting things is that he would sit down and he would contemplate for 3 or 4 days or a week on how to steal something. Because if he got caught, it was a serious offense. But he would plan it back and forth and how to do it. And he was usually successful. Now, why was he stealing? He was stealing not because he was dishonest, but they didn't pay them anything. You only got food, and you didn't get enough food to live. So you really had to steal in order to survive. And there's a certain morality here in that you steal from the factory owner. You steal from the guy who's the communist who has a lot of money. Don't steal from people who don't have anything. And a lot of times he would share his food, and he was living on a basic diet with those who were less fortunate than he was. There's a case of a woman who was living with a Jewish family, a Romanian woman, young child. She's very sick. Her husband is in the army. She hasn't heard from him for like 2 years. She's basically starving to death. And he would give her food. And that's what they would do. There was a lot of stealing and a lot of conniving going on behind the lines, but a lot of the Russians were, they were helping each other out. They weren't necessarily mean bastards. Now, there were some mean bastards. Mr. Neiman winds up in a village one day, and there are Ukrainians there. Ukrainians were bad news. They hated the Jews, and there's one Ukrainian there who's noted for, beating up Jews and killing Jews and taking whatever they had. And Mr. Neiman is sleeping, and this guy comes into his room with a big pat in his hand, and he knows what's going to happen. So Mr. Neiman gets up and he fights, and he chases this Ukrainian out. In any case, this is the story of Mr. Neiman. And he goes from one factory to another factory, and then when things get tense, he decides he's going to join the Polish army, because the Russians were forming a Polish army deep in Russia, which was good, because usually it would take him a month to get to the Polish army, and then he could ride the train. So like 3 times he says he's going to join the Polish army. And the first time he shows up, and he really wants to join the Polish army, but he gets there, and after a few days he realized this isn't the Polish army. This is these are Polish soldiers, but these are Russian officers, and they're using Russian, Russian equipment and Russian uniforms. So he quits the Polish army. He goes through 4 years of war, very difficult times, riding the train, practically starving, practically dying of disease. By May of 1945, the war is over, and he takes no joy. He's working on a factory at the end of the war. He knows he can't go home. He knows his family is dead. He's working, digging a sewer, and he meets a Jewish man who invites him home, and he gives him clothes, and he fixes him up, and he meets the man's niece. The man's niece, her whole family is dead. So he meets the niece, and Mr. Neiman gets married to the niece. And that was Mrs. Neiman that I met. And they wait about a year, and the Russian government decides eventually that if you were a Polish citizen, you could leave Russia. Well, it didn't take Mr. Neiman more than 1 nanosecond to decide to get out of Russia. He had enough of the Russians, he had enough of the communists. So he and his wife hop a train, and it takes about a month to get from Russia to Poland. While they're riding on that train, Mr. Neiman is sort of finagling, and he's stealing, and he's getting salt, and it's a whole long story. And there's one interesting story about being on the train and having 2 Ukrainians on the train, and they're boasting about how they killed Jews during the war. Well, Mr. Neiman sits there and he doesn't say anything. Well, when the train gets to Poland, Mr. Neiman doesn't get off. He stays on the train. The border guards take, he and his wife, they take their identification, they take their money, they take his wife's birth certificate, they take their marriage license, they took her Russian government, they took everything. So they go right through Poland, then into Czechoslovakia. They get off the train in Czechoslovakia, and they manage to walk across the border into Austria. Gets to Austria in late 1946. Now, what is he going to do? There are a lot of Jews in Austria, the Haganahs there. They want the Jews to go to Palestine. Mr. Neiman doesn't want to go to Palestine. He wants to go somewhere where nobody's going to bomb. He wants to go somewhere that's safe. He wants to go to America, but he doesn't know anybody in America. So he spends the next 4 years trying to figure out how to get to America. And that's a whole story about what he does and who he contacts and what he has to do. Finally, in 1950, he gets permission to go to America. Let me just read you what he has to say. This is how he concludes the story. I had no sponsor to come to America, so I had to wait over 5 years in the camp in Austria. Finally, in 1950, HIAS organization, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, agreed to help me come to this country. I was very happy when I heard that I was leaving Austria for America. I knew nothing about America and couldn't even speak English, but I was hopeful about my future. I had had a difficult time in Europe and had suffered much. I'd lost my home, I lost my family, and I lost everything that was important to me. Still, I survived. I was alive. I would do well in America. I arrived here in 1951 to begin my new life. It was a long way from my little village in Butowsky, Poland. So it's quite a journey from 1941 to 1951. From Butowsky, Poland to Long Branch, New Jersey. When I met Mr. Neiman 24 years later, he was still living in Long Branch, working as a butcher, which was, besides being a blacksmith, which was his trade. So, this is his story. I survived. My name is Yitzkhak. I haven't told you everything that's in the book. There's a lot more that's in the book. And it's all told in his language. And it's a remarkable story of human great determination and the will to live. He lost everything in the war, but he lived. He successfully came out, got to America, and established a new life for himself. So, if you want to buy the book, it's cheap. It's $15. And don't buy it from Amazon. Buy it from me. It's $18 at Amazon. I get only 50 cents. All right. Are there any questions?
Yeah.
Yeah. You've heard about 5% of it. And the one good thing about it is that it's told in his words, and it's a readable story. I mean, it goes very quickly. Okay. Yes.
I think something very interesting that struck me there was that being a butcher and a blacksmith, having these skills or trades, helped him a lot in his survival. If he hadn't had, they probably never would have survived.
He never would have survived.
Well, the reason it struck me is that the great African-American leader, Frederick Douglass, in the 1880s or 1890s, made a great speech. And he was telling the now free African-Americans that they should learn a trade, learn how to do something, not worry about all these other grand schemes that were going on, because if they did, they would survive, because if people needed some work done, they didn't care what people looked like or what religion they were. If somebody did a good job, they were happy to have them there.
You wanted them there.
Yeah, so I thought that was sort of underscoring what he said was true.
You know, being a butcher was really important because, one of the great problems during the period of the war was getting enough food. But if you could work, you worked in a factory slaughtering cattle, whatever, you could always, get some food working in the factory. But those were two skills that were very greatly in demand. After he came to America and he got his first job, he was working in an air conditioning factory. One of the things he used to do during lunch break was he used to make horseshoes. And everybody wanted a horseshoe. And he would make horseshoes for everyone. He could make anything with his hands. But those skills served him well. Yes?
Why did he keep wanting to go to Poland? I mean, Poland was, for a Jewish person, well, Poland, World War II was really a very bad place.
It was a terrible place. No, he didn't want to return to Poland. He, at the end of the war, he knew what was happening. There were pogroms. People were being killed. He knew if he went back to his village, nobody was there. The property had been seized. So he wasn't going back to his village. He was determined to get out of Europe. Get out of Russia, first of all. But come to America. He wanted to come to some place that nobody was going to bomb him. And he figured America was big enough that nobody was going to bomb America. And he was right. Nobody bombed him. And he has a statement there, and I have it quoted in the book, saying, you don't understand, Americans don't really understand war. Here you go to war and read about it in newspapers. You eat well and sleep well, and nobody bombs you. Over there, it was different. He knew what war was like, up close and personal. But no, he wasn't going back to Poland. But he, I think to the day he died, when I knew him, He always wanted to speak Polish. If he had a chance, he would speak Polish. And I think he always considered himself to be, he was very proud to be a soldier in the Polish army. I mean, he really identified with the Polish army and being a soldier. And that was important to him. Yes?
You mentioned that his second wife was a little upset that you didn't include more of her story.
I think she was upset that I didn't include her, and that was my mistake. I was young, and
do you have any tidbits of knowledge about her story?
I have her story in the last 2 chapters or 3 chapters, but it's only after she marries him and they're living together. But even then, the focus is really on him. And I think I upset the family dynamics. In his family, I mean, his wife was a college-educated woman, and his daughter was college-educated. Mr. Neiman didn't even graduate equivalent of elementary school. And, he had skills and served them very well in Europe and during the war, but when he came over here, he was just a working-class guy. And I really think they were a little ashamed of him, and they looked down upon him. And, I show up, and Professor not George Mason, Monmouth College, and I'm interested in Mr. Neiman, and I just talked to him. I should have talked to his wife. It would have been a better book. I should have gotten her story. I mean, I missed an entire story. And, what are you going to do? I can't go back. I mean, she died in 2002. But I really wish I had captured her story. It would have been nice to have folded it into the book. She's in there, but only in the last 2 or 3 chapters when she and Mr. Neiman are together. And they were working as a team.
They have kids?
They had one young girl, her name was Ann Levy. And I've tried to look Ann Levy up and find her, but I can't find her. You know how many Ann Levys there are in the New York City area? Probably 80,000. And the only thing I know was her husband was French. He was a Jew from France. He was a tank driver in the Israeli army. And then he was a truck driver, and he drove a taxi in New Jersey. Let me tell you, you never wanted to ride in the back of this guy's car. He drove cars as like he was driving tanks. He considered traffic signals and traffic lights just to be optional. I mean, if he survived to the age of 35 without getting himself killed in a traffic accident, I would be amazed. All right. Okay, I've got copies of the book here. If anybody wants a copy of the book, I'll autograph it for you.
Thank you very much, Harry.
Thank you.
Catch up ladies movie.